there. Welcome to Talking Data Equity. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder of an organization called We All Count. And the purpose of We All Count is to help anybody in any sector, in any part of the world that is working on a data project, work on that project in a way that doesn't harm the people that they are trying to make meaning with and for. We build tools and do trainings that help you align the specific way that you carry out your data and math tasks so that they're aligned with the priorities of your project and your community. And some of you already know that my favorite thing about this job is happening right now. Fridays at noon Toronto time, which is also like New York City and DC time, we run this drop-in event called Talking Data Equity. And it happens most Fridays. We're actually about to go on one of our longest summer breaks, but it happens most Fridays, and the Zoom link is always the same. And we never charge a fee, and anybody who's interested can drop in, and you can always go to the Talking Data Equity website, which I just put a link to in the chat, and that will tell you kind of what we're doing that day. And what we do varies. Sometimes we work on code together. Sometimes we share resources and create a resource sharing playbook. And sometimes we have special guests. And today is one of those times when we have a special guest. So I'm going to introduce you to our special guest in about 60 seconds. But before I do, let me answer a couple of logistics questions. We are going to be recording this session so that you can share it with your friends who might benefit a lot from the insights from today. And we're going to share it in the We All Count Data Equity Community Forum. I put a link to that in the chat as well. That's not a membership site. That's public good. Anybody can go and watch our videos there. We will also put the resources that our special guest mentioned. So you don't have to madly try and write down everything that we're going to talk about today. We're going to put links to the recording and all that stuff so that you can sit back and relax and have a good time. And remember that you are not alone. You are not the only person that cares about data equity and justice and community. So on that note, let me introduce you to our special guest who has taken time out of their schedule and out of their very important work and travels to be with us today. Let me introduce to you Dr. Jad Sinno, they, them. And Jad is the Director of Research at the Community-Based Research Center and an affiliated assistant professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health Sciences right here at the University of Toronto. They are queer, non-binary, and Shami Arab, bringing over a decade of the community organizing and lived experience to their research. Jad is a social epidemiologist and critical mix methodologist with research interests, including the social and cultural determinants of health for multiple marginalized queer populations, including mental and sexual health care and human and computer interactions. So you can see that Jad's work is right up our alley. We are super excited. And this is kind of part two of some of the conversations that I started a couple of weeks ago on trying to understand the Canadian census. But Jad knows about that and a lot of other topics. So let me turn it over to you, Jad, and also say thanks again. I know, like you said, you're just about to go off to do some big international research, and I really appreciate that you made time for us today.
Thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate the introduction and for inviting me to share some of my work and CBRC's work with this group. So I have a bit of a presentation prepared with some maybe tangible and practical resources, and I've sectioned it into four broad parts that are interrelated. And I've titled my presentation today, Who Counts? Inspired by We All Count. And in fact, asking the question, what does counting create? And so the topic of my talk today will be to focus on queer data equity, beginning with the census, which is, I think, what had inspired Heather to reach out to me, and to then situate that in conversation with community research. And so the talk will, by and large, begin with the 2026 Canadian Census and its historic advancements. We'll move into the community-led research as a different but complementary data infrastructure. I'll then talk about the emergence of bots and AI, which has been a central concern, I think, for online researchers, but also at our organization at CBRC, and whether the processes of trying to uphold data integrity is in conflict with actual data equity as we understand it. And then finally, I'll kind of delve into a bit of a theoretical talk around that data itself is a productive process that doesn't simply describe reality. So before I begin my presentation, I just want to make a note about language that I will, by and large, use the term queer, sexual and gender diverse, and 2S LGBTQIA interchangeably throughout the presentation. I recognize that all of these are imperfect descriptions of the sort of multiplicity of queer communities by and large, but I'm using them as a kind of proxy to explain the lived realities of what is otherwise a broad queer population, a broad umbrella. And then if I'm talking about a specific subset, I will name that particular group. And so I'd like to first acknowledge that Indigenous peoples of what is colonially known today as Canada. As Heather mentioned, I am currently situated in Toronto, colonially known as Toronto. That's Treaty 13 in the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am deeply indebted to my Indigenous mentors, peers, and persons that I have been in community with, from the East Coast, the Mi'kmaq, all the way to the West Coast on Coast Salish. And these individuals have enriched and shaped my research career, my academic career, and my personal growth. And because of this, I am very much committed to decolonization and liberation for all Indigenous and oppressed peoples across Turtle Island and across the world. And so I also want to acknowledge that CBRC, the Community-Based Research Center, is a virtual organization that operates across the country. And so we are continually in relation with Indigenous populations across so-called Canada. And most importantly, I think related to this talk, there are clear implications of decolonization as it relates to data equity. And so we can't really talk about data equity without acknowledging the Truth and Reconciliation commitments to decolonization, including the lived experiences of Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer folks across Turtle Island. And then more importantly, when we talk about data equity, how our lived experiences and our worldviews can either amplify or even sort of erase Indigenous epistemologies and lived experiences. So we really need to be interrogating our worldviews and the consequences of the behaviors that we are doing and the kind of data that we do. So I will sort of weave through a bit of Indigenous epistemologies and our commitments to CBRC throughout this talk, but I encourage you to also think about your relationship to indigeneity as you do your work in data equity. So what is this person's sexual orientation? The kind of key question that has sparked a bit of conversation and debate in this year's census. And the Canadian government writes that this question seeks to collect information on sexual orientation in order to inform programs that promote equal opportunity for everyone living in Canada to share in its social, cultural, and economic life. And when they present this question in the census, it is accompanied by a definition. So sexual orientation refers to how a person describes their sexuality. And I want to pause here for a moment and allow folks to think from a data equity lens about three broad questions that I'm hoping we'll be able to kind of have a bit more clarity about as we move through this talk. First, in your opinions, what does this question make visible? Secondly, what might it fail to capture? And finally, who is answering, and on whose behalf. So before we can start to answer some of these questions, I think we need to kind of situate ourselves in data equity. And I'm sure that the audience here is quite familiar with this topic, though there isn't a standardized definition across the literature. However, the notion of data equity aims to ensure that all individuals can benefit from data science, knowledge, resources, tools, and innovations, regardless of their backgrounds, identities, or circumstances. And in order to achieve this goal, there are practices that must be embedded into the entire data lifecycle that need to be both inclusive and accessible. And so data equity itself is this guiding principle that data collection, analysis, and application should be conducted in ways that minimize bias and maximize the utility for the entire population. Now, folks that work with data equity often are concerned with issues of representativeness, issues of like integrity of the data and its capacity for generalizability. Here, I start to disagree a little bit with what those elements are and how they might actually be captured, coming from a more kind of postmodern epistemology, just to mean that I understand the world fully as socially constructed. And I think that these measures of trust and representativeness aren't easily captured or reproducible. And so ultimately, I think we can understand data equity as the kind of intentional redistribution of power across the data lifecycle so that the data is benefiting the communities that it seeks to represent. And this can range all the way from deciding what is actually being asked to who gets to participate in the data collection and who then gets to determine how that data is interpreted, shared, and used. And so we, in working with data equity, need to ask ourselves recurring equity related questions. Who is defining the problem? Who becomes visible in our definition? What remains missing or screened out? Who controls the interpretation of that set data? And who benefits? Now, I won't necessarily go too deeply into Dr. A.J. Lowick's work. However, as I talk about sex and gender identity or SOGI related measurements and data, Dr. Lowick's gender and sex in methods and measurement toolkit really grapples with this question of once we sort of ask a question, what does it represent? What does it define? What is it actually measuring? And I encourage you perhaps to go and take a peek at some of their work when you have the time. But who am I? And why am I coming or how am I coming to this work? As Heather mentioned, I am the director of research at the Community-Based Research Center, and I am traditionally trained in quantitative methods at Dalhousie University, and then moved on to more interrogating the social, where I started to take on a lot more qualitative approaches and epistemologies and philosophies. And in doing so, I started to ask myself a lot about what does it actually mean to queer quantitative measurement? And that's kind of what culminated in my doctoral work that sought to explore reparation and transformation through quantitative measurements. And so I situate myself as a critical mixed methodologist and a person who works towards reparative social justice. Importantly, as a queer trans non-binary Shami Arab and somebody who has been deeply embedded within community, my work has by and large been informed by my community advocacy, the folks that I organize with, and the kind of calls to action that come from those spaces. And so this is where I find myself housed at the Community-Based Research Center, which is a national nonprofit bilingual organization that was founded in 1999, initially in order to respond to the HIV epidemic in BC, led by and for gay, bi, queer men. And over its kind of life cycle, CBRC has expanded in order to encompass the full diversity of 2S LGBTQIA populations. And our mission is to promote the health of people of diverse sexualities and genders through research and intervention development. So our mandate has also expanded well beyond just looking at HIV and STIs to kind of health from a holistic angle. And maybe of relevance to this group, CBRC operates from some key pillars that situate us as an organization, as a thought leader, and that we have the capacity as a national leader then to transform ideas into action that makes tangible differences and material differences for our communities. And in order to do this work, CBRC has published on our website our research principles. And it's a bit fulsome and detailed, but it encompasses a wide variety of various values, including access and balance and love and community empowerment and being impact oriented. So that's a couple of the principles that really guide how we approach our work. So I want to begin this talk in the first section, counting at scale. And so really interrogating what are the changes that have emerged that have brought us today to the 2026 Canadian Census. Inclusion did not happen on its own. In fact, the changes that we see today come from a long history of community-led advocacy, scholars and researchers and persons with queer identities who have called on the Canadian government in order to improve the measures that they have in the service of equity to represent our communities more accurately. So in 2003, Statistics Canada begins to integrate sexual orientation data in a few of its federal social services. And between 2003 and 2019, concerted advocacy culminated in CBRC acting as a representative and testifying, as well as submitting evidence to the House of Commons Standing Committee on health study. This included us calling the federal government to improve the data that they collect on queer communities. So then in 2021, the Canadian Census includes gender identity. And between 2021 and 2023, the Statistics Canada and the federal government begin consultations to develop a federal sexual orientation standard, which CBRC was a part of. In 2024, the Canadian government then did a census content testing and launched officially the sexual orientation question, which I showed you at the beginning of this talk, in the long form of the survey. I think a core message to understand here is that advocacy is a part of data infrastructure. What data we collect is actually led by community, led by the folks that seek to be represented by it, and it reflects what communities have been doing for decades in order to be demanded, in order to be recognized. And I also want to sort of note a brief tension here that following the consultations that happened, CBRC, and I believe, I can't really speak to many other organizations that were involved, I don't believe were then reconsulted or given the final approval to give the check mark on the questions that were published. And so it kind of begs the question of at what point is engagement enough and consultation enough, and what are the responsibilities of federal organizations and other national organizations to continue to return to the communities that they've consulted in final approval and ongoing monitoring of these types of inclusions. So we're in 2016, and the sexual orientation question is added into the long form survey of the census. It is approximately seen by a quarter of households across Canada, and it's asked to all members of the household who are 15 or older. And the census itself may be answered by only one member of the household on behalf of the rest of the individuals living with them. And the response of the question itself is broken down into three options and a written response. So heterosexual, lesbian or gay, bisexual or pansexual, and then an other option for people to be able to freely describe. And it focuses ultimately on sexual orientation as an identity category rather than attraction or behavior. And this is important because those elements measure different things, right? People might engage in same-sex relations or behaviors, but not identify with a sexual orientation identity. And so what we're actually capturing is a particular type of information in the census. And what I want to really emphasize here is that every design decision determines what kind of population can subsequently be known and understood. So what does this inclusion actually allow us to do? I want to first say that CBRC and myself strongly support the responsible, community-driven, and ethically governed data collection of data related to two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual populations. And to do so within the Canadian Census, as well as in other federal population-based surveys. Inclusive federal data collection is essential for our visibility as a community in order to move forward with our equity and to provide evidence-informed decision-making to policymakers who are more likely to respond to this type of data set. However, what this means is this type of data collection needs to happen in ways that protect our communities, ensure our meaningful participation, and prevent misuse or harm. So there's a couple of principles that CBRC holds internally, and that has been our fundamental position in relation to the census. Um, Federal population data is essential for our visibility and equity, and so we must be included within it. And so Canada's most comprehensive demographic instrument, which is the census, must represent queer populations. Because historically we've been erased from it. We haven't been accounted in these data, and failing to include us has erased us from the policy landscape, policy decisions, funding decisions, and even public health planning. And so the omission of 2S LGBTQIA populations reinforces invisibility, undermines our service planning, and is continuing to perpetuate the systemic inequities that we experience as communities. But the census, therefore, by including these types of questions, allow us to have national scale estimates. It allows us to conduct analyses across geographic regions that are typically hard to reach, for example, rurality or smaller communities. It can allow for connections of our data to issues of employment and our identities to issues of income and poverty and education and immigration and other social determinants. It also allows for a greater potential for intersectional analyses across sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as other social and cultural determinants like racialization, indigenous identities, and so on. And so the core message here is that the census allows our community to begin to document the long experience inequities that we have had, but census data carries a particular authority that governments and institutions respond to and therefore can facilitate change. So in preparation for the changes that emerged in 2026 this year, the Canadian government ran the census test in 2024 with about 222,000 households. Of those, 24,000 households were analyzed in the quantitative test between a control and test questionnaire that were testing this particular sexual orientation variable. What they found was that the test helped to determine whether this new or modified question that was under consideration could be easily understood and answered by Canadians by and large. And they note that the test ensured is a process that sought to ensure the high quality data be available within the 2026 census and in order to support a wide variety of programs and services in communities across the country. There is, however, a few concerns that emerged in actually how the questions are asked and how the census is completed. There is a proxy reporting effect that happens. So, for example, young people who live in households with parents who might not recognize their identities are having the census being completed on their behalf by somebody who might not recognize their identity or even know about their identity, and therefore they're not being captured in the census. And then also bisexual and pansexual people might also be less likely to be out to their family members and therefore, again, not being captured. So from the census test report that is published online, what we found is that it's possible for sexual orientation data for individuals between 15 and 24 to be more frequently reported in proxy as opposed to those who are in older age, meaning that there might be inequities that are experienced by younger queer populations and therefore not being captured in the actual census that is actually currently ongoing. Again, whether or not somebody is in a household with individuals that recognize their identities can also skew whether or not the data is actually the census data is actually capturing people's lived experiences and identities. We know that research from the United States, from the Pew Research Center, shows that bisexual individuals are also less likely to be open about their sexual orientation compared to, for example, lesbian or gay populations, in particular with their family and friends. And so this can obscure the kind of data that we are collecting. And then similarly, a recent publication by the Community-Based Research Center from our large community-led survey, Sex Now, showed that Government datasets may also significantly misclassify or underestimate the population size of queer communities due to underreporting and non-disclosure from queer populations. So, Sex Now survey showed in a population of roughly 10,000 or so individuals that about 86% of the participants would disclose their sexual orientation on a census, and 85% of trans and non-binary folks would disclose their gender identity on a government survey. And this means that about 15% of the population, at least within our non-representative sample, actually wouldn't accurately report their identities. And so this begs the question about what are we actually measuring and who is actually being invisible? And it asks questions about how then might we improve trust with federal organizations in order to support individuals in accurately reflecting and reporting their identities? So, from the Canadian Census test, they showed that 98.7% of the 24,000 people, households, sorry, that completed the test responded to the sexual orientation question. 0% dropped out after answering that question. However, among people who are aged 15 to 24, bisexual or pansexual identification was significantly lower in the Canadian Census test compared to the Canadian Community Health Survey. So kind of reinforcing what we might kind of know already about whether that's obscuring or non-reporting within these samples. And so what does this actually mean? It actually means that inclusion is an ongoing commitment, not an endpoint, right? So limitations continue to exist even with the inclusion of the sexual orientation question in the census. Proxy reporting might erase closeted individuals or differently understood identities are not necessarily captured. Grouping bisexual and bisexual identities might conceal meaningful differences within that group in particular. The right and option itself might not guarantee that smaller identities will be reported separately. And how the data is recorded, recoded, or combined after the fact is also a productive process of choosing to combine people in certain ways. Importantly, two-spirit peoples are not directly measured at all in the census, and younger people, people younger than 15, also remain absent. And then what we know ultimately is that disclosure may be influenced by histories of state surveillance and oppression, and data suppression could still limit practical access to smaller communities. So the census, including this question, isn't a kind of uh, ironclad response to data equity, right? There's an ongoing need for commitment. So then what is our path forward? We ought to ensure that we make individual questionnaires easy and confidential, that we clearly communicate privacy and data protection practices, hopefully in order to enable folks to more accurately report their identities. We might want to also report the number of proxy effects, messiness, and disclosure limitations transparently so people can interpret the data accurately. And I think what we really ultimately need is to establish sustained community governance over the interpretation and the release of census data. So CBRC's internal position is that we affirm the need for clear, transparent, and community-led governance models around how data is collected, how it is stored, by whom it is accessed, and how it is accessed, for whom it is shared with and in which ways it is interpreted. We think we need a community-led framework in order to determine how this data is actually being used and collected, and it needs to be robust. And we think that decision-making processes should happen with a representative sample or a diverse sample at the very least of community-based, queer community-based members. And there are some good examples of what this might look like. For example, governance frameworks that include kind of an Indigenous liaison program when federal data is actually being collected. So we know models like this exist, and we can replicate them to respond to the unique needs of queer and diverse communities. I think also in our move forward, we need to have some special considerations about the data for children and youth. So for individuals who are under the age of 15, sexual orientation and gender identity data must be collected with heightened ethical care. And this is particularly important because one, parents report it, and there is often tension in how queer youth and parents relate to one another or understand each other's lived realities. And we also are in a period of heightened transphobic rhetoric and violence against gender diverse communities, particularly towards trans and queer youth. And so that data can be mobilized in the service of harm. And that is especially important that we pay attention to the way that we mitigate that. And so CBRC ultimately urges Statistics Canada to proceed cautiously to minimize the risk to youth. For example, outing them or causing family conflict or the misuse of data by parties that are not interested in data equity. We also think that the data needs to be contextualized appropriately, acknowledging the limitations of how it's collected, and then community experts and youth need to be consulted throughout the entire process in the same way. And then maybe I'll just note here that we really do affirm and reaffirm that queer youth and minors deserve and should have the right to independence and agency in their own expression, self-determination, and how their data is collected or not collected and used. So we know that the census can move us forward in ways that are important and can provide data that is helpful, but it also is situated in a fair bit of limitations. And I think this is where we start to count with community, and this is where community-led data enters the discussion. So these are two complementary data infrastructures, and I don't want you to think of one as better than the other. In fact, they can be in conversation. Importantly, neither data set is the complete truth. And data equity as a principle requires knowing what each of these sets can make visible and what each can systematically miss. So federal government surveys, as they continue to increasingly integrate sexual orientation and gender identity measures, provide a lot of benefits. They offer representative large samples of queer populations that enable comparisons with the general population. They can offer standardization and geographic comparisons, and they hold a lot of strong authority in policy settings and therefore can facilitate systemic change. The challenges, as I've mentioned, are around issues of variable suppression. Although we purport to or hope to be able to get in-depth analyses through this data set, there continues to be limited capacity for intersectional analysis. So samples are seldom large enough to be able to conduct precise intersectional analyses. So from the Canadian Community Health Survey between 2015 and 2020, only 4.3% of all participants were classified as sexual minority. And that really isn't enough for us to be able to do that type of intersectional analysis that is important for data equity. We know that there's issues around information bias and proxy reporting. There's an issue of inconsistency in measurement in the way that sexual orientation and gender identities are differentially asked across these surveys, and so we're not able to necessarily replicate or know that we're measuring the same construct. And often we conflate behavior or romantic attraction or identity in different ways across surveys, which is not representative of people's realities. And at the end of the day, these are crude measures. They have not been captured well to represent the intersecting identities of queer populations, and community-led data can start to fill in some of these gaps. So the benefits of community-led data is in order to expand health issues and communities through a focus on by us, for us. So by broadening health issues that are being explored and engaging communities throughout the entire process, community-led data actually is aligned directly with community needs, and community-based surveys can advance the unique health needs of 2S LGBTQIA people. And therefore, because it is led by communities and for communities, the measures are more nuanced. So community-based measures of sexual and gender orientation might be less prone to information bias. There's a whole slew of questions often that are included in our surveys in order to capture the diversity of lived experiences and the different elements of that construct. And because it is a queer community-led survey, we tend to recruit large samples of queer populations that enable the kind of intersectional analyses that census data wouldn't allow us, or federal health data doesn't enable us at this time. Of course, there continues to be challenges with community-led data, and so one of those is non-representativeness of the samples. because we're often relying on non-probability purposive sampling methods, these may underrepresent certain populations or may limit the capacity for us to generalize our findings to the broader population. That being said, these are themselves not necessarily limitations if generalizability isn't exactly the end goal of community-led data. In fact, we could be trying to interrogate power relations or unique health experiences, and the data itself can provide rich context for that particular issue. Now, community surveys that utilize in-person recruitment methods have been generally found to also overrepresent queer populations that live in urban settings. And so community-led data have really been underrepresented of rural spaces, and that's where potentially federal data can start to step in to fill some of these gaps. So ultimately, the research has demonstrated that data about key health outcomes within queer populations can differ across public health and community-based data sets due to differing informations or selection biases or even how the questions are being asked. So I think the path forward here is to use these two data sets together in order to get a more fulsome understanding of the unique lived experiences in the service of transformation and data equity. And community-led research can ultimately change the problems that we consider worth studying, who's eligible to participate. So you could potentially run studies exclusively with youth. You could use inclusive language in ways that can be amenable and responsive to the unique and changing needs of queer populations. You can tailor how you recruit to go directly to where populations actually are. So, for example, we've recruited at prides annually and in queer bathhouse and at queer bars. So we really go to where the populations are themselves in order to capture them. And our outputs are often created directly to respond to the unique needs of communities. So the data is always meant to return to the populations that it sought to serve. And I want to emphasize here that community consultation is distinct from community governance. And so just engaging people isn't enough. In fact, we think that community should continue to play a role in data stewardship and data ownership. And this is why we think organizations like CBRC play a key role in data equity processes. And our community work has several products, and I won't really go into them in too much detail, but we have two large-scale surveys that happen almost annually. For example, Sex Now, which is Canada's longest and largest queer to LGBTQIA survey that is community-led, and in recent years has expanded its its focus to beyond gay bi queer men to including two-spirit people, trans men, non-binary people, and most recently women and femme participants. And then Our Health was the first community-led Canadian-wide health survey of all queer populations, and it grew out of the recognition that many queer women and gender diverse people have not been centered in health research in Canada. The takeaway here is that community-led research has a focus and an importance on ensuring that there is strong population health data about diverse queer communities. And you can see on the screen some examples of specific reports that are directly tailored to diverse and intersectional queer populations within Canada. And so the approach and the learning from community-led surveys is that our expansions don't actually just represent adding identity categories and checkboxes. They are a reshaping of sections of relationships and bodies and sexual practices and health and service utilization in order to uniquely capture the lived experiences of our communities. And so expanding eligibility changes the entire questionnaire, right? We start to ask entirely different questions when we focus on unique populations. We're not just changing the demographic section. And so there are three key practices that emerge and learnings that emerge from community-led data. The first is about community-informed measurement. So we need to have more nuanced questions around sexuality, gender modality, and even two-spirit measures. We need to improve inclusion through our survey design. And CBRC has a lot of approaches like robust tools and designs that are designed specifically through 2S LGBTQIA community involvement. So, for example, our approach to measuring two-spirit identities was informed by Dr. Harlan Pruden and Travis Salloway in a two-step approach that has now culminated in one that we believe more accurately reflects the indigiqueer and two-spirit identities of populations that we engage. So the second is about intentional recruitment. So we recruit, for example, at Two-Spirit powwows or trans-Pacific events, or we go to where intersectional and ethno-racial diverse communities are, in order to ensure the representation from populations that might not be connected to mainstream data collection. And we also leverage leadership from people who are embedded within those communities in order to increase the recruitment. And ultimately, we aim to oversample from communities that have been historically underrepresented within these data sets in order to be able to understand their unique lived experiences. And then the final pillar is about monitoring and adapting. And so as recruitment is going on, we're constantly paying attention through a maximum variation or purposeful sampling approach to understand just how many identities are we capturing in our data sets. And these strategies have led to large increases in the proportion of diverse queer participants that we recruit. So, for example, in our recent 2025 survey of Our Bodies, Our Health, um, about 11% of our participants were Indigenous, 7% were Black, 32 were racialized, 27% were trans, and 21% were not born in Canada. And these are all queer peoples. And so this allows us to be able to understand the intersectional experiences of these populations in more detail. Now, importantly, once you've collected your data, equity doesn't stop there. And this is our commitment here at CBRC. So we move beyond just the process of extracting data, and we do so in multiple approaches. The first is capacity building. So Investigators is one of a few capacity building programs that CBRC runs. It is initially targeted at queer youth, but now has since run various iterations. But it's research and capacity building for lay queer audiences in order for them to generate research questions and participate in data interpretation and conduct data analysis that's related to their lived experiences. We also have community specific reporting, so our data is often presented in a lay format for a lay audience to return it to communities. And we hold our annual summit, which is a conference that brings about 600 individuals from across Canada, but largely uh, community, youth, and people who serve queer populations, not just academics and researchers or healthcare providers. And we also have accessible data tools that are made available. So on the screen is an example of our Sex Now data dashboard, which is an interactive representation of a data repository from Sex Now surveys to allow individuals to interact and play with our data set to better learn about the data that we have collected. And so there are four practical questions when we move beyond equity after data collection. What is this data set good at answering? Who is likely missing? What collection decisions shape the sample? And what claims can or cannot be made from this data set? And so while there are many limitations that I've identified, we know that online community research can reduce the sort of geographic, financial, mobility, and disclosure barriers that are happening. But online recruitment methods that have happened since the inception of the internet introduce a new problem. And so we have to answer the question, how do we protect integrity without policing legitimate participants out of research? So at the sake or the cost of data equity. And so here, part three, I'll talk briefly about counting under suspicion, bots, AI, and access, which, like I've mentioned, has been like a key concern for CBRC as we continue to conduct some of our research. So there really is a kind of access integrity paradox that is emerging in the contemporary context. And when access and integrity are in conflict with one another, we must ask who gets excluded and under what sort of assumptions. So online data collection can expand access, but bots and AI have now become a stress test for data equity. There is a rise in research that is being conducted online, but it's coming with significant risks of fraudulent responses like bots or scammers or people that participate in research for illegitimate reasons. And so then given also the rise of queer-phobic rhetoric across Canada, there's also a drop in support from people and participate in the research, and some people might actually have malicious intent in order to like stifle or misappropriate the data that is actually being conducted. And so this has resulted in a loss of confidence in a lot of data sets and online recruitment approaches. And as a result, we've sort of put together in collaboration with IGAL and other partners a bots, AI, and false responders toolkit in order to provide resources for researchers who are conducting online research with communities in order to improve the trustworthiness of their data sets. And so there's a couple of examples here on the screen. And so I don't really want to belabor this, and the resource actually has yet to be published, but it's coming out any day now, so you'll potentially find it on EGAL and CBRC's websites. But you would take a multi-pronged approach in order to, for example, use a CAPTCHA, which might block automated responses, but it also can exclude people with visual or cognitive disabilities. You might look for consistency checks in order to detect fabricated identities, but this can penalize complex, fluid, or poorly measured identities. So people's identities, even within the same survey or their experiences, might not be reported consistently. And then you might flag that as an individual who's not a reliable response. And so the sort of approaches that we take in order to improve the quality of our data set can also come at a cost for the types of people who might be multiply marginalized and continue to be historically excluded from our data. And so as we improve our trustworthiness, we have to ask at what cost and who is being excluded. And so there really needs to be a layered and accessible response. And I think this looks like a four-step process of beginning with before we even collect the data to make sure that we're co-designing with an integrity plan for affected communities, oversampling for anticipated exclusions, and then having monitoring and compensation rules that are transparent. During recruitment itself, I think we need to have recruitment that is led by trusted peer and community members to be able to stagger the recruitment with separate links in order to sort of ensure that not the entire data set is compromised, and to offer multiple accessible models in order for people to participate in our data collection. Within the collection itself, I think we should monitor patterns in real time to ensure the reliability. And in order to use these kind of alternative measures as checks and balances, not verdicts. So treat metadata and IP and timing and attention checks, so on and so forth, as indicators, and you must then yourself start to measure whether or not that is a reliable response. And then at the fact of cleaning, we need multiple indicators that suggest that the data is compromised. We need to use both a human and computer informed review process, and we need to document our exclusions decisions in order to be held accountable. And so treating fraud detection as an adjudication, not an automation, is the goal here. So keep principles of equity and anti-oppression in mind as you use them as guiding principles in your data cleaning processes. So this is going to come to the very final part of my talk, which I will keep quite short, but is part of emerging theoretical work that I am participating in, particularly about what is actually the productive and power relation that underlies counting, and what does that actually mean? So from classification to repair, what are the implications of counting? And so every day, data decisions will actually create a population. Data collection itself is a productive process. It's not merely reflective of a lived reality or an objective reality. You are participating in creating realities that you are claiming to measure. So the census question makes queer populations newly legible to the state, and community surveys can create more detailed and recognizable accounts of queer life. And then your bots and screening rules might determine who is accepted as a real member of that population. And the analysis and your reporting determines which differences become policy relevant. And in all of these different formats, what we see is like you have created a new reality in your approach, potentially reifying a certain population or experience and obscuring another. And so you must then make a decision about what your responsibility is in the realities that you create and how you disclose that. And this is where some of my work around querying quantitative measurement emerges. I will just briefly go over these three policies because I would love to leave some time for Q&A. I am mindful of the time that we have. So firstly, numbers are situated representations, not neutral facts. So numbers do not simply emerge from the world and speak for themselves. They are produced through decisions about what to ask, who to recruit, how to define the variable, which responses to exclude, and how to interpret the results. And so a number such as the proportion of bisexual or pansexual people in the census might be momentary representations that are created within a particular social and political and methodological context. And while useful, are not time immemorial representations. And so we must acknowledge that. The second is that categories are provisional tools rather than permanent truths about people. So categories can be politically necessary, and they make certain marginalized populations visible, allowing us to document inequities. But categorization itself is also an exercise of power. The approach here, for example, of combining bisexual and pansexual people is producing a certain particular type of population for analysis that might actually conceal the differences that are meaningful between bisexual and pansexual populations. And so querying quantitative methods does not necessarily require that we abandon categorization entirely. It means that we need to use them strategically and transparently in the service of transformation and reparation. And finally, is that analysis should be iterative and interpretive. A raw data set does not actually lead to a single correct model. In fact, every time you clean the data set, you create a new reality and a new world through decision-making processes. How you decide to clean the data, what you decide to exclude, how you decide to recode your data, what kind of model you choose to do the analysis, produce multiple reasonable versions of these findings. And so this is where I've introduced a reparative and transformative mixed methods approach that embeds reparation in the quantitative methodologies that we embody. This paper has been under review for like 3 years. I believe it's going to come out pretty soon, but ultimately what I will say is we need to embrace alternative forms of reasoning and analyses. So for example, abductive reasoning, which can often be called inference to the best explanation, is a logical process that stands as unique from inductive or deductive reasoning by looking at observations and working back towards finding the most plausible and likely explanation. And then multiverse analyses allow us to understand that each data set creates a multiverse of realities, and then your obligation as a researcher is to maximize the multiverse and interpret across all the different ways that you might clean your data set. So you should make every reasonable decision to clean and categorize your populations from your raw data sets, and then analyze all of them and interpret them together. And this is where I've like sort of worked on my reparative and transformative approach. This is a pretty dense slide, and I don't know if I want to go into it in very much detail, but I will say that this is, again, a forthcoming manuscript that emerged from my doctoral work that you can see at the bottom here, integrated a kind of iterative circular and emergent approach where I went back starting with my qualitative interviews, and I saw a bit of a interesting point coming out of the queer populations who use dating apps that I interviewed. And I thought to myself, why are they identifying this particular context as a way that might indicate what they purported to be safety and I potentially thought might be ableism that was concealed? But what that encouraged me to do is to then go back through my survey open responses and my survey quantitative measures and analyze and reanalyze the data in order to better understand what was actually unfolding within that process. And so this slide will be open here. You'll be able to maybe read it back at your own pace. But I want to maybe just like say that I approached my data set with curiosity, that offered me the opportunity to respond to unexpected participant insights. So I didn't have only an a priori hypothesis. I allowed it to be driven by the data set. It allowed me to then revisit my measures, to test new analyses, return to the narratives, and then produce actionable interpretations. The outcomes of this analysis really was a question of how do we balance perceived safety to ableism in the social media age, right? Because pushiness or certain behaviors can be perceived as unsafety, but ultimately is a form of laissez-faire ableism. And so this directly relates back to how we make decisions about who we perceive to be a bot. Is it actually just people who communicate differently online, or disabled populations, or migrant populations who might not be able to necessarily engage in your survey in meaningful ways, right? So we need to really hold equity at the core of the decisions that we make. And so I will close my presentation with this sort of data audit slide. There are 6 key elements that you ought to look at when you are reviewing your data set for equity. Um, the purpose, so who's defined the problem and for whose benefit. The participation, ask yourself who can actually safely and accessibly answer your survey. The classification, who is recognized, combined, or rendered as other. The credibility, whose responses are actually trusted, doubted, or excluded. Your interpretation, who has the authority to explain what a data actually means. And finally, action. What will happen with that data set? Will it be returned, changed, funded, or repaired? So I encourage you to have 3 key commitments as we walk away from today's presentation, that the visibility must always be accompanied by community power. Federal and community-led data should be combined thoughtfully, not ranked as competing truth. And finally, data integrity must be protected without treating marginalized populations as suspicious by default. So the goal is not simply to count queer communities more accurately. It is to build data systems in which communities can recognize themselves, challenge power structures, and shape what happens next. Thank you.
Fantastic. I hope you can see on the screen there is lots and lots of Zoom emoji love. Dr. Sinno, that was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Just
Thank you. Thank you.
absolutely exactly the kind of uplifting rhetoric accompanied by actual nitty-gritty. How do we do this in our data that all of us are so much looking for? I hope you can see the chat. If not, of course, it will be shared, but there's lots of admiration and love in the chat and real appreciation, Jad, for the clearly deeply thoughtful and practical work that is so aligned with principles. It's so easy to talk
My
about
pleasure.
stuff like this. It's much harder to do it in quantitative data. And we will be looking excitedly for that article that's in review. Please definitely email me when it comes out so that I
I
can share it
absolutely
with
will.
everybody here.
Yeah.
And it really means the world to us, first of all, that you're doing the work that you're doing. And secondly, that you made time out of your really busy schedule to share it with us.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you so much, everybody, for your kind words in the chat. I do see maybe a couple questions. I don't know if we have time to respond to them, but if folks would love to email me, I'd be very happy to respond to you and maybe be in conversation if that's nice. And if maybe you're the Toronto region, maybe we can go for a coffee. So,
Yeah, let's do that.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Everybody take really good care of each other and yourselves. You are not alone. You can reach out to us. You can reach out to others in the community. We are definitely all in this together. So thank you so much. And thanks again, Jad. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Heather. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.